So the Justice Reform Initiative has been around for about 4 years, and we are a national advocacy organisation. It was started by my chair, Robert Tickner, who, as some of you might know, was one of Australia's longest serving ministers for Aboriginal affairs. He served in both the Hawke and Keating governments. And one of the things that I guess, amongst many other things, that Robert was responsible when he was in Parliament was actually he was responsible for getting the states and territories to sign up to the recommendations of the Royal Commission into Aboriginal deaths in custody. So obviously that was more than 30 years ago. And I guess it's probably fair to say that Robert is pretty heartbroken at the lack of progress. And his impetus for starting this campaign was really recognising that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have been absolutely leading this work in Australia, and that there was a need for many more allies to come behind that work and to elevate that work, and also the need for there to be people on all sides of politics that got behind this work. So I'll talk a little bit more about that as we go through. So our goal is to reduce incarceration by 50% by 2030 and to really try and build a community where disadvantage is no longer met with a default criminal justice system response. We're working to try and change the public conversation and public policy away from building more prisons and move towards elevating evidence-based approaches, things that are actually going to break that cycle of incarceration. So just in terms of the scale of who we are and what we do, we're funded through philanthropy. We've got a little bit of funding from a few other small donors, but primarily through the Paul Ramsay Foundation, which enables us to employ the equivalent of 8 full-time staff around Australia, but about 14 people that are employed mostly part-time. So we are working with parliamentarians from all sides of politics, and really trying to elevate this conversation about what evidence-based justice policy might look like. We've got sort of, I guess, coming in behind us, we've got 131 patrons, which is quite a lot. But that includes 2 former Governor Generals, former members of Parliament, lots of really incredible Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander leaders. We've also got a growing number of supporter organisations, people like the Australian Medical Association, the Law Council of Australia, the Catholic Archbishops Conference, lots of First Nations-led organisations. And then we've got this growing number of individual supporters who have signed up to support the cause, that have signed up to social media across various platforms. So we're growing. We're new, but we're growing. When we sat down to talk about what we wanted to achieve, the question, as is often the case, I guess, when you're sort of developing a bit of a campaign and you're developing a theory of change, is we looked at what we felt the problem was that we were solving. And I will talk about some of the things that I think that we might have missed when we did this sort of 4 years ago. But I think a lot of it the analysis I think was still spot on. That is, we've got this problem where we overuse prison in Australia. It's become both a default measure to address crime in the criminal justice system and also this default system to kind of manage complex disadvantage. So lots of people are managed in prison settings rather than receiving the sort of support and care that all of us require in the community. But of course, as we know, prisons don't work to either deter people from committing crime or to address the drivers of crime. We also know that alongside this and connected to this, there is a systemic failure to address the underlying social determinants of contact with the justice system, and I'll talk about what they are as we go through. And then connected again to this, one of the other problems, the big problem, and I think this is really significant, especially in the northern states of Australia and WA, Queensland, and the Northern Territory, that being perceived to be tough on crime has become this very convenient, very politically accepted strategy in response to crime, partly driven by media's addiction to sort of a particular sort of reporting of crime, which is dehumanizing and perpetuates this idea that we need to be tough on crime through often policies that end up increasing incarceration. And then I think this is sort of really the frustration for so many researchers and academics and people that are trying to build the evidence, is that we actually have a pretty extraordinary body of evidence about the failures of incarceration and also about what might work instead of incarceration to build safer communities. But despite this, there's very limited commitment to or even awareness of what an alternative system might look like, how we might build alternatives to prisons or pathways out of prisons on the part of policymakers and also on the part of the general public. So the policy context, and this is very broad, but just so that and all of this, none of this will be new, but we know that over-incarceration of adults and children in Australian prisons is incredibly harmful. We know it's expensive. We know it's also ineffective. That is, it doesn't work to address the causes of crime, doesn't work to rehabilitate, as people often describe prison's ambition, certainly doesn't work to deter people, and in fact, it increases the likelihood of people going back to prison. We also know it contributes to disadvantage. So we have lots of people where imprisonment forms and perpetuates disadvantage rather than ameliorating it. And we also know that it disproportionately and shamefully disproportionately impacts First Nations people. When we started this campaign, and this is a whole other presentation which I won't go into here, but just we did decide to do some market research when we first started this work, and used the SHAPE agency, who we work with around strategic communications, and their sort of sister agency Insight, to do some market research for us. So that involved more than 2,200 survey interviews. And I guess the take homes from this, so this was us trying to figure out, well, if we want to reduce incarceration, we need to understand where people in Australia are at in terms of their understanding and experience of incarceration, and how high this sort of is on people's list of priorities in terms of the things that inform their voting concerns. And one of the things that we found, and again, I think there's more work to be done here because I think it's a different story up north to Australia to what it is down south. But what we did find overall is that, and at the time we did this research, we were right in the thick of COVID. So the over-incarceration of people in Australia is not at all one of people's priorities when it comes to their voting concerns. Crime comes in there, but not actually that high at the point that we did this survey. So the things that people were concerned about were things like health and the economic situation and employment, climate change, but things around justice and safety were down the list, and the over-incarceration of people in Australia was right down the bottom. We also found that most people in Australia rate themselves as having incredibly limited understanding and experience of incarceration. And this was really interesting to me. So 78% of people said they just didn't know very much about it at all. And a wild number of people had absolutely no contact with the justice system. So that includes not having called police, not having interacted at all with anybody. So a third of people, more than a third of people, said that they hadn't had any contact with the justice system. So that's important to us. We did a whole lot of segmentation analysis based on people's voting preferences and so on to try and test messages that would cut across a range of different demographics. When we tested factual messages about incarceration, the things that the audience were concerned about were interesting, and again, perhaps not surprising, but for a lot of people that work and research and advocate in this space, often the reason that we're sort of drawn to advocating are because of things like the sort of significant human rights violations that occur in custody, the overrepresentation of First Nations people, the overrepresentation of people with disabilities. What we found when we tested factual messages, that is sort of, stats, gave people stats and then asked them about and gave them sort of information. When we tested for concern, the things that people were most concerned about, the things that cut across all of those different segments, was how much it costs to lock people up, and also that alongside how ineffective it is. So people were really shocked when we tested messages around things like recidivism, how many people come back to prison. When we tested impact messages, which were messages designed to elicit more of an emotional response, the things that people were really concerned about, or the demographics that people were concerned about, were perhaps not surprisingly the incarceration of children and the incarceration of women. I'll come back to that and we can talk more about that research, which is getting on for 4 years old, but it did inform how we sort of, I guess, attacked our messaging approach when we were looking at campaigning, and really influenced the jailing is failing sort of messaging that we have been progressing as something that cuts across a whole range of different segments of the population. I'm going to rush through this because I feel like you will know it, but it's really just to give you an overview of where things are at in Australia, and all of this is on our website as well. But, close to 40, this will be high. So this is obviously taken from the ROGS and ABS data that came out sort of at the beginning of this year. It'll be higher, I think, when it comes out next year because of what's happening in WA and Queensland. But close to 42,000 people locked up across Australia, with New South Wales having the highest number overall. The rate of change, I've just popped here two different columns just because there was quite a significant reduction in incarceration as a consequence of COVID, primarily a few other reasons, especially in jurisdictions down south in Australia. And so the growth kind of steadied and didn't sort of keep going. But you can see in places like Queensland, Northern Territory, WA, there has been significant growth over the last decade. Obviously, places like Tasmania and the ACT we need to be a bit cautious about because the numbers are so small. I just grabbed this off the ABS, the corrections data just recently because WA has had such a significant growth in terms of the rate of incarceration over the last 12 months. And it's sort of, I think, pulling the kind of Australia, which is in the middle here, up. But other jurisdictions like Victoria and New South Wales are actually still trending down post-COVID. Flow through population, I just put here because I think it's really important that when we're thinking about what service delivery responses, which is a big part of the work that the Justice Reform Initiative is trying to do, where we're saying we need to build things in the community, we need to really, I guess, recognise how many people are walking out the prison door each year. So, and obviously some of these people are the same person, but the actual numbers of exits, it's getting up to 67,000 across Australia. We know that there is significant overrepresentation of First Nations people. This just shows you that WA is significantly sort of over-incarcerating First Nations people compared to the rest of Australia, followed by the Northern Territory. When you look at proportion, this is adults, by the way, but when you look at proportion of people across Australia, 33% of people in Australian prisons are First Nations compared to about 3.3% of the population. We also know we've got wild numbers of people on remand in lots of jurisdictions. So across Australia, getting close to 40% of people haven't been sentenced yet, or will not go on to be sentenced. And we know that the majority of people in prison today, if we were to take a photo of everyone in prison today, we would see that they have been there before. And if we were to look at who's coming back within the next 2 years, about 43% across Australia will be back within 2 years, but that varies across different jurisdictions. We know it's really expensive, so more than $6 billion a year to lock up adults in Australia, and that doesn't include a lot of the new infrastructure that is currently happening. I'm going to quickly go through the kids, and obviously we'll talk a little bit more about who the people are than who the kids are that are going into prison. Again, this is going to be significantly higher, I am anticipating, because of what's happening in Queensland when the new ROGS data comes out, but this is the 22-23 data. About 828 children on any one night are incarcerated, but a wild number more sort of coming out of prison each year. And this really gives you a sense of the short periods of time, the kind of churn in the children's prisoner population. Again, incredibly troubling overrepresentation in terms of First Nations populations. We can see in places like the Northern Territory, 94% of children that are currently locked up Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children. We also know that almost everybody who goes to prison as a child in Australia goes there on remand, and the vast majority do not go on to serve a sentence. So we need to, when we're thinking about service delivery or building up alternative responses, this is a really critical area. And we know it's also really expensive. That's just the sort of operating costs, 855 million, probably close to $1 billion. Well, actually more than that if you count the sort of investment in infrastructure. And again, I'm not going to spend too long on this because I feel like everybody on this call knows all of this, but we know that people that are going into prison have significant other forms of disadvantage. in terms of mental health conditions, disabilities, alcohol and other drug dependencies, homelessness, employment, coming from postcodes of disadvantage. And we know that situation is absolutely the case in terms of children who are incarcerated, including the numbers of children that have disabilities and that have experienced out-of-home care. And we know from Ruth McCausland and Eileen Baldry's linked administrative data that there's very clear social determinants that increase the likelihood of incarceration, including having early contact with police, having unsupported mental health and cognitive disabilities, and having drug use, unstable housing coming from disadvantaged locations. So I'm going to move to the bit where we talk about how we bring about change. So I'm sort of assuming consensus because there is in the research literature around who goes to prison, well, the demographics. So the question of how we bring about change is really the focus of the work that I do. And I'm going to talk about that for the next sort of 10 minutes or so. And then we can have a bit of a conversation about that, especially, I guess, around how we elevate evidence-based justice policy. So when we did that sort of theory of change work a few years back, the four sort of key strategies that we elected to focus our energies on are firstly systematic political advocacy. And what that means is really working each of the parliaments in Australia, both like all sides of parliament and the crossbench, to really try and introduce the idea that we have got this wrong, that we've got the policy settings wrong, and we need to do things very differently. Changing the public conversation is the other critical part of this campaign work. That is, we need to change the media and public narrative from the current sort of tough on law and order focus to one where prisons are viewed as harmful, they're viewed as ineffective, and there's a strong public understanding of an alternative approach. And I'll talk about how each of these are sort of tracking in the next few slides. We need to increase public awareness and support so that there's many more people that are engaged in the movement that can act as conduits for justice reform in a whole range of different communities and also in terms of political advocacy. And we also need to work to connect stakeholders and advocates so that there's this joined up effort to sort of bring together advocacy and reform groups in Australia that are unified, with this idea that we need to reduce the number of people in prison. So I will chat about how these are going, but I also just want to talk about some of the other strategies that I guess have become a little bit more evident over the last 4 years, and we're about to go into a sort of a new strategic planning process. We're very fortunate that we've got additional funding from the Paul Ramsay Foundation for another 5 years worth of work. And so for us, that's a big opportunity to go, how are we tracking? How's it all going? What else do we need to do? One of the things that has become really, or some of the things that have become important, that alongside those core four strategies, so systematic political advocacy, changing the public conversation, increasing public awareness and support, and working to connect stakeholders and advocates, there's also this other piece of work which is about elevating evidence-based justice policy. So this is importantly not just about what research there is, but how we communicate that research. The other thing that's become very clear, and it's sort of, embedded in our thinking early on, but it's taken on a lot of weight, I guess, as this campaign has developed, is really recognizing the importance of incorporating multiple different voices. And I guess by that, when we're talking about sort of campaigning in terms of social justice issues, there's lots of different ways that you can go about that, and there's no right or wrong way, of course, but often campaigns in this space have been values-led. That is, it's a lot of people, trying to sort of elevate a social change issue by appealing to shared values with lots of different people. We are not trying to do that. We are very much a purpose-led campaign. And that means that we are inviting people to take part in this advocacy, and we are opening the door to the campaign for anybody, regardless of their values or political persuasion. And really saying it doesn't matter whether or not the main reason that you're really concerned about locking children up or locking adults up is because it costs a lot of money. Or you think it's, a sort of a waste of human potential, or you think it's a human rights sort of tragedy. For this campaign, we want everybody to come on board, regardless of what their reasons are for thinking. As long as you think that we're locking up too many people, then we are welcoming people to the campaign. And I can talk more about that. It's a complex space sometimes to inhabit, especially for people that have primarily worked in social justice areas and have historically been associated with the left of politics. And just by way of example, for instance, on my team, on my team of staff, we have staff who have worked as sort of political staffers or chiefs of staff for Greens politicians, and we also have staff who have worked as chiefs of staff for federal Liberal Party politicians. And I guess that what I'm trying to do on the ground, we also have lots of staff with lived experience. What I'm trying to do on the ground is build what we're trying to do in the community, which is saying this should not exist just for one side of politics. This needs to exist across the spectrum. And there's lots of reasons to get behind it. The other thing that I guess is a new thing in terms of the campaign work that we've been doing is around centering people who have experience of criminalisation and incarceration. And I guess that's not a new thing for people that work in service delivery, and it's not a new thing for people that have worked in disabilities and mental health, but and it's certainly there have been people with lived expertise of incarceration that have been doing this work for decades in Australia. But there is a really strong emerging new voice in Australia, which I think is absolutely fundamental to the success of the campaign, of all the campaigns that are happening around justice, ensuring that the voices of people who have lived in prison and family members of people in prison are part of that conversation, both in terms of the expertise, but also in terms of the centrality of those stories in humanising what it is that happens, and ensuring that people who have not, like the 78% of people that just don't know very much about it, are able to really, I guess, connect in a much more profound way with what prison does to families, communities, and community safety. The other things, I guess, over the last 4 years that have become very clear in terms of some of the additional challenges to bringing about change and things that we didn't necessarily think, we didn't have in our initial strategic plan, but it's become clear as we're sort of talking to government regularly, is that there are lots of barriers to change that as advocates and campaigners, we absolutely need to recognise. We don't need to solve all of them. We need to mostly ask government to solve them, but they're not critical when it comes to getting principles across the line, but they are critical when it comes to the implementation of things like significant injections of funds into the community sector, for instance. And those sorts of challenges include things, and these are what come up time and time again with meetings with politicians, also meeting with public servants, siloed funding streams, kind of public service and bureaucratic inertia. I can talk more about that as we're chatting, which is not to say people aren't working really hard, but the difficulty of trying to get change in some public service settings and getting governments to genuinely, we talk about whole of government all the time, getting governments to actually work in that way. Also, workforce capacity and development issues in the social services and NGO sectors is really critical, especially in places like WA. Inadequate and piecemeal, like totally inadequate community health and social sector funding, which comes up time and time again, especially when looking for really sensible legislative reform. So things like raising the age or things like decriminalising drug use. The thing that often comes up as a barrier on the part of, the political barrier will be, well, we can't do that yet because the social sector isn't, or the services aren't ready to go. So these are just to sort of name that there are these, like the implementation of change is not straightforward. It should never be seen as a reason not to do change, but it's not straightforward. So I'm going to talk just in the last sort of 5 minutes or so around the work that we have been doing over the last 4 years, and then sort of a little bit of a like how are things tracking, where are we at with bringing about this change. So we've had heaps of political meetings. I'll talk about how they've been going. That is a really regular part of every single staff member, has lots of political meetings and really tries to progress work, sometimes with very clear policy asks, sometimes introducing this idea, sometimes really trying to have private conversations with parliamentarians from all sides of politics to really say, can you just be sensible during this election, for instance? Haven't obviously been very successful recently with that. We'll talk about that. We've got, in terms of that bringing stakeholders together, we've got close to 200 supporter organisations signed up to the Justice Reform Initiative website, and ongoing sort of collaboration and working with just hundreds of different amazing advocates, service delivery providers, and people across the sector. So that's tracking pretty well. Relentless meetings with stakeholders. And again, this is across Australia over the last 4 years. That's been such a big part of the work that we've been doing. We are counting all of these things. I'm happy to talk about how we're counting these things and the sort of the database that we're using to collect all of this. Like I said at the beginning, lots of supporters signing up to the website, many more sort of following us on social media. In terms of stuff we're putting out, we've put 40 submissions into various parliamentary inquiries around Australia. We've released 17 reports, and they've usually been associated with media strategies, events, and sort of moments to bring public attention to the report. So these are all on our website, but reports into state of incarceration and also reports into what alternatives to incarceration look like, what the evidence says we should be doing. Heaps of public talks, we've organised a number of public events, including some significant big kind of moments, including a youth justice event with the Federal Children's Commissioner a couple of months back. Constant sort of media releases and engagement with the media, lots of op-eds. We're trying to do a lot of work around centering lived experience voices. So we've got a couple of kind of pilot programs running, lived experience speakers bureau training. We have webinars which feature staff that have lived expertise of incarceration alongside guests that have lived expertise. And we've taken carriage of the reintegration puzzle conference. So we ran our first one this year. We inherited that beautifully from Joe Graffam and Deakin University, and we're running our second one next year in Alice Springs. Lots and lots of community building, so lots of out there selling T-shirts at WOMAD, festivals, partnering with organisations like Big Heart, doing sort of coming on as impact partners in a whole range of different documentaries, going to Labor sort of policy conferences, doing the same with all the different political parties. Heaps and heaps of media in terms of getting this stuff on the agenda. These are all lots of supporters signed up. So how are we going? At the moment, I would say it's really mixed, but there's a huge amount of work to do. There are plans to increase prison infrastructure in heaps of jurisdictions to respond to overcrowding again. There's sort of almost like two different stories, what's happening up north and what's happening down south. Queensland's building 3 new children's prisons at the moment. The Northern Territory and the Queensland governments both won recent elections with pretty horrendous law and order campaigns, including Queensland just very recently, and both are implementing legislation that will dramatically, and in Queensland, really dramatically increase the number of children that are going to prison and going to prison for long periods of time. So there's a real shift in a really troubling way in those jurisdictions. We know WA is seeing also significant and dangerous overcrowding in adult prisons, especially over the last year. We are seeing continuous and serious human rights violations, harmful, trauma-reinforcing conditions inside all of children's prisons around Australia, and almost all adult prisons as well. We know that children are dying in custody in WA, and the failings in the structures and the systems have been made very explicit through recent coronial inquests. And, it's heartbreaking. We're going to look back and be absolutely heartbroken at the way in which we incarcerated children in Australia. Continued shameful overrepresentation of First Nations people, continued use of indefinite detention, including for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people with cognitive impairment, and ongoing massive gaps in community-led alternatives. This is sort of a very quick overview. I want to sort of finish with some things that I am tentatively optimistic about. We have seen some significant retreats from politicised law and order rhetoric and politics in a number of jurisdictions. I think most explicitly in Victoria, where both parties have actually really deliberately made the decision to walk back from that approach. And for the last couple of election cycles in New South Wales, we've also seen people walk away from it. The former NT government gave it a crack and failed, but they gave it a crack, which was a really big deal in the Northern Territory. They did, raise the age of criminal responsibility. They did get rid of mandatory sentencing. All of that has since been repealed. So we know that shifts can be made, but they're often very fragile. There are significant reform commitments in Tasmania, especially around youth justice, that include an absolute commitment to shutting Ashley, obviously on the back of a horrendous commission of inquiry talking about what had happened to children in Ashley. There is a commitment to raising the age of detention to 16 in Tasmania, a commitment to an incredibly progressive youth justice blueprint. And a commitment to there's been an upper house inquiry that was supported by all sides of politics. We've also seen in the ACT really important commitments. They've raised the age. They've got a government commitment to justice reinvestment and restorative processes. We have seen ongoing, successful, relentless, and powerful advocacy by First Nations organisations, especially in Victoria, which has led to multiple policy and legislative shifts, including a winding back of incredibly harmful bail legislation and a commitment to raising the age of criminal responsibility, not high enough, but a commitment. We have seen reductions in prison numbers in a lot of jurisdictions across Australia since 2019. Again, the sort of accidental sort of experiment of getting people out of prison as a consequence of COVID, but also sustained advocacy around maintaining that downward trajectory. We've seen significant reductions in children's imprisonment in Victoria, New South Wales, ACT, and Tasmania, although I'm not sure what's happening with Tasmania and the numbers are very small, so we'll have to look and see where that goes when the next set of data comes out. And we've got public policy commitments to reduce recidivism on the part of the ACT and South Australian governments. We also know that the planned and budgeted new prison in Tasmania that we and many others have been campaigning against is no longer going to be built, so that is a good thing. The business cases for new prisons in both South Australia and New South Wales appear. In South Australia, it's been made explicit. In New South Wales, no one's talking about it, and we're just assuming it's gone, but they appear to no longer be on the table. There has been a shift in language, even in the most punitive context, so even in the Northern Territory and Queensland recently, where alongside talking about how tough on crime and adult crime for adult time and all of that sort of rubbish, you're also having the same leaders talking about the importance of early intervention, the importance of prevention, the importance of diversion. And I just want to point that out because that has not always been the case. So there is a growing recognition that it's not okay to just lock kids up. There's these other things that perhaps are important in terms of addressing the drivers of crime. We know many, many more people with lived expertise, and this is growing all the time, which I find incredibly exciting, are participating in conversations and advocacy about incarceration. There are many more people, like over the last 4 years, there has been a real growth in the number of people that are talking about the harms of incarceration. And I guess that the reflections that I'm in a privileged position to be able to make, because we have had so much political access, is that almost everybody that we meet with agrees in private that what we are doing is not the right policy. We shouldn't be incarcerating as many people. We shouldn't be locking up so many children. We shouldn't be sending so many people on remand. We should be funding more alternatives that have an evidence base. And most of the public absolutely agree with that too. When we have that opportunity to have public conversations, many people agree with the proposition that jailing's failing. The challenge with both the public and the political is still shifting that agreement into leadership and into action. I guess just to say, and I was just saying to Stuart before the call started, I've spent the last 2 days at the New South Wales Drug Summit, which I guess has really made me reflect on just what a slog this work is. I've been doing this work for 25 years, and there's many more people that have been doing it for a lot longer, especially, for instance, in the sort of movement to have drug decriminalisation on the table. In New South Wales, the last drug summit was in 1999. There was a drug summit over the last couple of days, and I guess there's a real fear and anger amongst advocates and service delivery providers and people that are using drugs and people that have used drugs that we will be having the same conversation in 25 years' time. So I guess that my reflections is, I'm also terrified about that with over-incarceration. I think we need to recognise it is a slog. And for people that have been saying this stuff for a long period of time, I guess that what does fill me with optimism is there is a growing movement in Australia of people that are specifically focused on this work and intentionally focused on this work. And I guess that need to build the campaign so that there are so many more voices, so that people that have been doing this work, especially Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people, can step back when they need to have a break, and there's many more voices that can step in. And I guess the other thing, and I was really thinking about this at the Drug Summit yesterday, is that we do need to think very boldly about the way in which we imagine a different kind of system and work really hard and really persistently to instill that boldness in our political leaders. I can talk heaps more about all of that, but I'm going to stop sharing now and perhaps leave the rest of the time for chat if we want to.
Thank you so much, Mindy. That, not surprisingly, an absolutely compelling argument. Clearly you know this area inside out and back to front, and I appreciated that it's a call to action for all of us to do our bit to help create this change. We've certainly got our work cut out for us, but I really appreciated that you've articulated a vision and also pointed to some silver linings on the clouds that we have in front of us. Look, I'm sure there are. I've certainly got things I'd love to ask you about, but I'm sure others do as well. So I'll turn it over to others on the call. If anybody wants to ask a question or make a comment, please unmute and go for it. Well, while everybody's gathering their thoughts, I'm just going to jump in, Mindy. And one of the things that I was curious about is I was really gratified to hear you talking about the very intentional approach of not making this a partisan campaign. So it's not one of those things that's going to swing from left to right and get variable support. And you kind of alluded to some of the challenges of that. And I wonder if you're in a position to sort of elaborate a bit. I'm mindful a number of years ago, encouraged by Louise Sutherland, who's a member of our group, I had a meeting with some folks from IPA, the Institute of Public Affairs,
Yep.
which people may know as a very conservative, right-leaning organisation, and it was a real opportunity to find out where the overlap is. I don't know if that's the sort of thing you're alluding to, but I'd love to hear your thoughts
Yeah,
about that.
absolutely. And yeah, we've absolutely met with the IPA as well and have worked with them around, a number of issues. Now we've got different opinions. I guess so on that, I think we're not going to win this unless we really take the politics out of it. And that means that we do need to find ways of communicating with people that are not necessarily concerned about the same things and that, may be quite conservative. I think that one of the things that Robert Tickner was quite sort of inspired by, although I hesitate to use the word inspired because it doesn't, we should never be inspired by looking to the United States when it comes to anything to do with incarceration. But one of the things I think that he was struck by, and so was I, was that 4 years ago at the last presidential debate between Trump and Biden, they were arguing about who was responsible, which party was responsible for the failure of mass incarceration. And they were arguing, this is in the third presidential debate, they were arguing about who could get more people out of prison. And that to me is wild, and to Robert is wild, because it is very difficult to imagine Australian politicians having that same conversation, going, well, you're responsible for this mess of mass incarceration or hyper incarceration. And I think that's really important because the movement in the United States and lots of places now, rhetorically, what's happening is a very different thing to what's happening on the ground. And I'm not for a second suggesting that the United States is where we should be looking to, because it's disastrous in lots of ways. But it is a really important, I think, shift rhetorically, politically, what's happened. You had Trump inviting the employers of America to come to the White House to participate in second chance hiring. You had right on crime, sort of right wing activists that were saying that this is a terrible misuse of taxpayers' funding, and also tapping into kind of Christian redemptive narratives around everybody should have the opportunity to have a second chance. We haven't seen that very much in Australia, and it's not necessarily that we need to replicate that, but we do need to think about ways in which the failure of incarceration and the failure of incarceration to keep communities safe is something that isn't sort of relegated to the left, isn't relegated, because at the moment it has primarily been such a small group of people that have been worried about this or talking about this, and it has historically sort of occupied a particular political space. And I guess that what we're trying to do is say this, it shouldn't. There are lots of things to be concerned about that cut across, politics. So yeah, I can see some of the hands up.
Thank you, Mindy. That's a furious agreement. I really appreciate what you're saying. You said it so well. I think we have Lindsay and then James.
Thanks, Mindy. As always, really nice to hear you speak on the topic. I think my question is actually quite similar to Stuart's, but one thing that was kind of resonating kind of from the beginning of your talk was just around how you said we need arguments. And I think kind of I took this as, and I guess my thinking as what types of evidence can exist as researchers to appeal to both ends of the political spectrum, like in order to address this issue. And you presented at the beginning the 2,200 interviews that you did, and just the kind of interest and the concerns and some, I guess, lack of experience on the issue. And to avoid being here in 25 years and keeping in mind, like, yeah, that political spectrum argument, how do we convince people that the non-believers, I guess you could say,
Yeah.
that another way is possible? So yeah, in 25 years, we're not still having the same conversation.
Yeah, look, I think that it's such a good question. And that question of how we message this stuff and also the mechanisms that we use for getting these messages out is really important. So I have definitely shifted in terms of, and I continue to shift in terms of my reflections on the best way to do this. So there's lots of different ways. If we had hundreds of millions of dollars, we could run an advertising campaign, but we don't. So we have to think about, what other ways we have to kind of connect with people across Australia. There are people that would sort of say we need to do deep canvassing, we need to build kind of an army of volunteers and be out there really having those conversations in communities that are genuinely suffering because they don't feel safe, or there are crime waves and there are lots of other social issues going on. There are other ways of approaching, like really targeted social media campaigns around swing seats, for instance. So there's ways of getting very sophisticated in your messaging approach that I think we are really starting to kind of think more about. What we have done to date is we've been trying to make sure that there are voices in mainstream media conversations that are presenting a different view and that are elevating the evidence. So that are saying, look, hey, did you know that if you put support around somebody when they walk out of prison, they are 62% less likely to reoffend, if blah, blah, blah. So we're used to kind of elevating those kinds of stories, using different ways of storytelling in the mainstream media. I think we have to keep doing that to ensure that continues. But I guess, and I suppose this is a kind of reflection, and I think we need to all do this as advocates in terms of whether or not what we're doing is working. I will just say that I worry sometimes that even when we're doing that sort of engagement with the media, and I feel like we're doing it pretty well, and there's lots of other advocates that are doing it really well. So, for instance, we launch a report in Queensland, we get the front page of the Courier Mail, we have a presser, there's all the different TV stations that are there, and we're ticking our boxes going, yep, this is what we want to do. We want to get our message out there. But Queensland over the last few years has, really in terms of their policy settings, has gotten a lot worse. So the question for us is, look, either we need a lot more time to kind of really land those messages, which may be the case, or it might be it's not making a difference. And we need to consider that as a possibility. Sometimes I think maybe we're selling papers because we know that conflict sells papers. Maybe we're participating in a conversation that is not necessarily changing anybody's minds. And maybe there's other ways of changing minds through targeted social media messaging, through deep canvassing, through citizen juries. There's all these different things that we could and should be looking at. So I think it is going to be a bit of experimentation with different approaches. And I think that then the key thing, though, is there needs to be many, many more people saying the same thing. So I've got 8 staff. We've got a bunch of people that want to volunteer. We're running around like maniacs. We're all exhausted. I want to, we need to, and there's so many more advocates in the space just even over the last 4 years, which is amazing. So I think that needs to keep growing. And then we need to be really thoughtful about how we target the messaging. And sorry, there's one more thing, which is in terms of the language that we use, I think we need to be really smart around that too. So we've been using the jailing is failing sort of tagline as the kind of cut through a range of different ways it's failing. And, it's a nice, neat tagline. There's lots of different ways to critique it, and we've definitely been critiqued for it, but it cuts through to lots of different populations. We need to think about some of the ways in which most of the population thinks about jail, that real fast thinking that people do, where they think jail, they think criminal, they think bad person, they think nothing to do with me. So we need to sort of, I think, get even smarter about how we're talking about that stuff. So that's stuff that I'm really interested in sort of thinking through more.
I guess another thing that comes to mind is like change does take a long time, and it's really hard to accept that in these types of circumstances where we know what people are experiencing right now and have been experiencing in the past. So it's like thinking, 5 more years even is too long, but in reality, this is a blip in human history and we're doing as much as we can. And just, another thing is just like thinking around, like you said, different perspectives and who the messaging is for. And I think, I think we're doing a pretty good job in Australia of providing different types of evidence, like, politicians might be more interested in like how cost effective is this, like what's it going to mean for the budget. Service providers might be more interested around health. And I think one approach, like, because I've also got a position at the Murdoch Children's Research Institute, and last week Stuart had to do a pitch around for philanthropy funding, and everybody associated with our group had all these really cute, photos of kids that were sick in hospital, and unfortunately didn't work because I don't think the appetite's that high to fund, youth in crime, and there's so much concern around that right now in the media, but maybe like we need to apply that particularly when it comes to youth justice. Of the reality is these are extremely socially and health disadvantaged young kids, really. So maybe like continuing to massage those messages, but it's obviously not simple. Anyways, I think I've taken up enough airspace, but thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, Lindsay. James, you had your hand up and then down. Are you relinquishing?
Yeah, I was trying to synthesize my thoughts. I just was kind of wanted to say something about housing, because I just feel like safe, affordable housing is such a massive barrier to judges being able to make decisions that would keep people in the community. Because I think by and large, judges will want people to not. Most judges, I think, don't want to incarcerate people if they can avoid it. That's a very big generalization, and I know that they are bound by the current policy and legislation, but it's obviously what you're doing around public advocacy, shaping public opinion, and political engagement is really important. But I think housing policy, for me, it feels like low-hanging fruit, but I know it's been so difficult, but affordable housing has just gotten out of reach for so many people. And I don't know, I thought I'll see what comments you.
Yeah, no, it's a huge, and I guess I probably should have put that in terms of those sort of other systemic barriers. There's no way you can untangle this conversation from housing and from the housing crisis when we know 50% of people coming out of prison don't have anywhere to live. So it's absolutely central. The way that we're sort of trying to, because there are quite a few housing and homelessness sort of advocacy campaigns, we're trying to get behind as many of those as we can and ensure that for folk who are incarcerated, that those campaigns are working for them as well. So I think there's ways of doing it that are, and certainly when we're looking at what the evidence says works post-release, we know that housing has to be sort of a central part of that. And as you point out, absence of housing is such a critical point at that front end, at the point of court as well, in terms of actually providing opportunities for people to get bail and so on. So I think it's really, and I guess that sometimes, the overwhelm with these campaigns is that there are so many intersecting sort of social issues. But I think housing, at the drug summit for the last couple of days, it came up again and again and again. It's like we can't really be talking about AOD policy without talking about housing, because it's such a critical issue for the populations that are most at risk of being criminalized because of their drug use. Anyway, so yes, it's huge. And I guess that part of this, so we back the Everybody's Home campaign. A lot of our state and territory campaigners are members of alliances to end homelessness in different jurisdictions. So we're sort of trying to participate and elevate other kinds of campaigns that we know will also have an impact on the outcome of reducing incarceration.
Thanks, Mindy. A great comment, James. I think the last word probably, or the last question at least, will come from Lucas. Please, thanks for waiting patiently there, Lucas.
Thank you, Mindy. You're the best. You, mate, I love hearing you talk all the time. I'm literally sitting here doing a social impact framework as we speak now for people coming home, right? And the things that just jump out at me is the diversity of the challenges that are faced. What do you think the number one thing that you can see being problematic in the next 5 to 10 years in the Australian setting, and what can we do as groups and individuals to try and challenge that challenge?
For people coming out of prison?
Yep, people coming out, yep.
So I think there's two things. One of them is the housing stuff that we've been talking about, but the critical thing is an absolute absence of NGO funding, so funding for organisations that really know how to do that work. I think that when I look around Australia at, what we spend on incarceration, and when I look around Australia at what we spend on the kinds of things that we know actually make a difference, and we list a whole bunch of them in all of our reports, especially, and there's pretty good research around the post-release space, both here and overseas, saying, look, if you wrap support around people at the point of release in the way that I know that you are very familiar with, Lucas, if you, and that support often does have housing, if not actual housing attached, then housing advocacy as part of that service delivery, then you are going to see significant reduction. So I think the big challenge for us over the next 5 years is getting government to take that part incredibly seriously. At the moment, and I know I've only got 2 minutes, but I think that there is unfortunately a real disrespect on the part of a lot of governments around Australia for the expertise of both people with lived expertise of incarceration and the expertise of people that run community sector organisations. Because, and this is not just because I used to work in service delivery in the community sector, but it is so often the case that the things that are really obvious to the people, the humans that are either leaving prison themselves or working with people that are leaving prison, it is so obvious what the gaps are, what the absence of funding is, and what needs to happen in order to keep somebody safe, alive, and ultimately out of prison. That is not commonly known among, it's surprising how few people really recognise what is required. And it's surprising how little attention government gives to those small organisations that are achieving huge outcomes. Often there isn't a big piece of research around the work that they're doing. They're just doing amazing work and got amazing stories. Government won't take them seriously. So I think there's a piece of work to be done around elevating the respect in which NGO sector, First Nations led, and people with lived experience are actually treated and understood by government. Because I think for them, it's this gift, the community sector is here saying, hey, we know how to do this. We're really good at it. We know what works. And we've often got people in government just not paying attention or thinking that they can run a program that's going to be doing something which is impossible in the context of criminal justice. So yeah, that's respect and housing and funding are the key things.